Hello, my name is Jasson Casey, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Beyond Identity. I recently gave a talk at a university titled The Myth of MFA. And the focus of the talk was to really reach a diverse audience of both researchers, faculty, students, and practitioners in the world of identity, cybersecurity, and engineering, and talk about what are the modern problems that actually undermine most organizations. What are the active threats that they are faced with? What does a security incident look like? And fundamentally, why is identity and MFA oftentimes the culprit that lets the adversary through? So it was a well-received talk, so we decided to record it in webinar form, and here we go. So let's start off and talk about this news article. So at the end of last year, the U.S. Treasury was breached, and it was breached through a third-party piece of infrastructure, something called a vault, product of a company called Beyond Trust. And the purpose of a vault is to store secrets and credentials that are used when you are elevating privilege or talking to very secure but very high-risk systems. We don't know how exactly at this moment, but the adversary was able to access the vault, remove some of the secrets from the vault, and use those secrets to access critical systems. And the speculation was it is Chinese threat actors going after things like economic contingency plans and sanctioning plans around a potential Taiwan invasion by China. So why are we talking about MFA again? MFA is kind of boring, isn't it? Well, what does this slide look like? What's going on here? This is a satellite image, or it's not a satellite image, but it's an overview image by the Institute of Study of War by the contested lines in eastern Ukraine between Russia and the state of Ukraine. And this is a very active conflict. Obviously, there's no way you don't know about what's going on. But the very opening hours of the invasion in Ukraine wasn't described by a physical attack. It was actually described by a cyber attack, specifically against the command and control infrastructure of the Ukrainian army. What is this? This is the island of Taiwan. This is the apple in the eye of the current leader of China. We are all very, very worried that there may be an invasion of Taiwan sometime in the next 2 to 4 years. And again, the openings of any sort of invasion or military action is very, very likely going to be cyber action. And again, the reason is to disrupt command and control. Now, a defense of Taiwan is generally not going to be carried out by just Taiwan. It will be at least it is perceived to be U.S. and U.S.'s allies in protecting Taiwan. And so a very likely first strike by any sort of China aggression against Taiwan is to disrupt the command and control, not just of the Taiwan's military, but also of the U.S. and the U.S. allies in the Pacific Rim that are there to actually defend Taiwan. And again, this is likely to mostly focus on cyber in the opening hours. So what are these 5 images that I'm going to walk you through? Well, I'll foreshadow a little bit and basically say I'm going to walk you through 5 security incidents that have turned into breaches. Well, 4 breaches and 1 ongoing activity that all occurred within the last 12 months, most of which are conducted by state actors. We actually don't know too much of Mamba just yet. And they were very, very successful at breaching an identity and authentication system. So we've already talked a little bit about the Treasury exploit. And again, this was essentially stealing a secret, copying a secret out of a vault and using that secret as a form of authentication access to some high-risk system. Midnight Blizzard. Midnight Blizzard is largely believed to be a Russian state actor going after Microsoft infrastructure. What was reported on the beginnings of Midnight Blizzard, effectively 13 months ago or so, was Russian actors were able to access, through either credential reuse or weak credentials, what Microsoft called a non-production system. Once they were able to get access into this non-production system, they were able to achieve some sort of authorization token and then laterally move into production systems. And when you get into the heart of the CSRB, as well as some of Microsoft's own reporting, they can't really even comment to the extent of what documents were or were not accessed in this breach. Clearly a bad thing. Salt Typhoon. Salt Typhoon is a persistent activity run by Chinese threat actors. Specifically, they were able to exfiltrate a large amount of messaging data from AT&T's system and infrastructure. And what was initially released is the initial access actually occurred through credential reuse. So as a primary password with credential reuse. And it was stated that there was no sort of secondary factor on this particular high privilege system. All right, fourth is Services Australia. Think of this as a public service in the country of Australia. A threat actor was able to achieve access, and I actually don't know what the first factor bypass was, but the second factor bypass was push bombing. So push bombing, for those of you that don't know, is an adversary either is able to steal your credential or man in the middle of your connection. And as they are trying your first valid credential onto the target service, you get a push notification, typically on your phone. In this particular case, the person hit decline. The threat actor tried again. The person hit decline. The threat actor tried a third time. And maybe the TV show or the Netflix special was just really, really good. And the victim essentially hit accept. Usually this occurs just to kind of make the error go away. The victims aren't necessarily technical. And the threat actor was then able to achieve an authorization as the victim into Services Australia. And then finally, we get to Mamba. Mamba is very interesting because Mamba is an active cybersecurity campaign built around a phish kit that is man-in-the-middling connections to not just steal an initial credential and not just bypass a secondary MFA, but also then steal the resultant bearer token. There are no publicly reported victims of this campaign that we know of right now. Maybe that's changed when we did the original research a couple weeks ago. So then the question arises, well, how do we even know about this? Well, we do find residual bits and pieces of the Mamba campaign in exploited infrastructure, because in order to run a man-in-the-middle attack, you actually have to take over some infrastructure. Generally, you want to take over infrastructure that has a valid domain name that's existed for a while, that has a valid certificate that is in good service. And you want to exploit that infrastructure because the hallmark around things like domain name protection and around certificate protection really has to do with legitimacy and validity and time and existence and relevancy, like how often do people go there. So it's a lot easier to find a service or a site that's already in use, exploit that site, and then basically serve up things like targeted JavaScript at the victim to then run an authentication bypass. And we'll actually show a variation of that here in a minute. So identity is really supposed to be the bedrock of security, but it is the weakest link. And we'll get into some statistics on how weak it actually is. But when you think about identity, identity is the bridge that everyone and everything must cross to get to your data or your services. So it is the natural point to kind of understand and inspect what's happening, who's requesting access to what, and also to provide enforcement. But when we start to look at the stats, we're going to build a picture that basically says in almost all cases, identity is actually failing to provide a security result. And the adversary oftentimes is not breaking in, but merely logging in. So how hard or how easy is it to actually pull off these attacks? Well, let's start with an attack where we're actually going to phish a victim. We're going to phish the victim with some sort of social engineering line of like, hey, this is your boss. I need you to log in and approve something for me immediately. So let's get this moving. So the victim has just received a message. In this case, the victim's name is Alice. So Alice is going to attempt to log in to this link to try and approve the bill her boss just asked her to approve. Little does Alice know she's about to be man in the middle, or she is being man in the middle. Alice is using a second factor. In this case, we're using a second factor through Duo. But really, the purpose of this demonstration really is any sort of push notification. So Alice is going ahead and send a push notification. Alice receives it on their phone. They hit accept. And now they are into the infrastructure, and they're going to go about their business and try to essentially carry out the action that they were asked to do through that phishing email. Meanwhile, on the adversary's infrastructure, the adversary was able to not just capture, the username and the password, but more important than that, they were able to capture the session, the cookies, the bearer token, and those end up being trivially used to hijack Alice's accounts. Session hijacking is what you will traditionally know this as. Let's show a slightly different version. So in this setup, we're going to go after someone using Microsoft infrastructure. They'll be using Microsoft Authenticator. You'll see Microsoft number match in play. You'll also see a biometric. So this is a possession proof, right? They possess the authenticator. This is an inherence proof, right? They're using a biometric for something that they are. So it's a two-factor possession and inherence proof. And actually, I'm not sure what you would call the number match. The number match it's a very weak form of proof that the same person is controlling both devices, as you will see. So in the top left of this screen is the phishing email the victim has just received. Again, it's a very similar setup. Hey, I'm your boss, and I need you to do something really fast. Okay, I'm going to log in. And off to the right, you'll see the victim's Microsoft Authenticator, where they're using essentially passwordless Microsoft number match and biometrics to authenticate. And down below is the adversary's infrastructure. So you'll see how that works a little bit in more a minute. So the victim has clicked the link, and now they have an Azure AD login screen. You'll see it's mirrored on the screen down below in the adversary's infrastructure. We'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. They type in their username to log in. And then you will see Microsoft Authenticator engage. They'll provide the number match. They'll also do a biometric. And now they're in. And now the victim is going to click around and try and accomplish the goal they were asked to. But you'll also notice down below, the adversary's infrastructure appears to also be logged in. So what happened behind the scenes here is we ran a man-in-the-browser attack, which is a variation on man-in-the-middle attack. The infrastructure we're using, by the way, is EvilGenX. It's a pretty popular open source toolkit to actually explore identity-based exploitation through phishing. In this case, we were essentially serving up a phishing link where the phishing link is just deploying some JavaScript drawing a canvas. And that canvas is really just, you can almost think of it as a remote display mount using a legacy protocol called VNC to some infrastructure that was pointed at Azure AD, at the victim's Azure AD instance, basically being used in kiosk mode to trick the victim into logging in, providing their credentials. And of course, at the end of the process, the adversary now is not only logged in as the victim, but also has access to the victim's session token, which they can now use and essentially assume the victim's identity. So everything I just talked through seems like a lot of work. So it's actually not a lot of work, but for sake of argument, let's assume it's a lot of work. We can just buy these things. We can just go on an underground site and we can buy credentials and we can buy session tokens. Because again, these things are not necessarily bound to devices. They move, they're copyable. Anything that moves from a digital perspective is actually very, very difficult to defend against, to protect, to track. That's a theme that we'll come back to. So I just showed two ways, but are there different ways of exploiting authentication? There's lots of ways of exploiting authentication. Now, in many of these cases, the root causes really boil down to just a few things. but either attacking the device or the user themselves. There's a lot of different ways adversaries, or a lot of different tools adversaries can use to essentially hijack your session, inherit your identity, and have a fun time at your expense. So how often does this actually happen to an organization? Well, according to Verizon's database of incident response, this happens 84% of the time. Most security incidents the average organization deals with are identity and authentication failures. So is MFA and is authentication fundamentally flawed? That's really kind of the question. And we think the answer is yes. And so first we want to explain a little bit on why. So what we're showing here is a little bit under the covers. It's still cartoonish, but like, how does authentication actually work? When you go to log into a service will then challenge you, right? And then you will respond to that challenge with a challenge response. In a password-based system, typically what you're doing is you are expected to transform that challenge using your password into some way that the cloud service can kind of verify that transformation. So if it knows your password from ahead of time, it can compute what that transformation should look like. And if you supply the right transformation, then you must be the holder of the passport, right? Even when we add in two-factor, the protocol largely stays the same. A challenge comes across, you send a challenge response, and this is what we do to essentially then decide, are you the right person, and should I issue you a token that you can then use for subsequent transactions to where you don't have to log in every time you click around a website. And the fundamental security guarantees of what I just showed you hinge on the concept called TLS. TLS, Transport Layer Security. It is a private channel that your traffic usually runs from your browser to the web service. And this is a view that you probably have of what the world looks like. And a lot of your developers may even think this is how the world works. But if only things could be so simple. Any sort of modern service today ends up being built in a more complex fashion. First of all, if you are at an enterprise, there's probably reverse proxies in your enterprise that are opening up that TLS conversation. Anyone who's building a service is probably pushing their static assets out through a content distribution network so that they can be served up faster. In order for that to work properly, your CDN is going to open that TLS connection. You probably are deploying in some sort of region or region concept, if you're not in Amazon, where the first device that traffic hits in a region is an application load balancer run by AWS or F5 or, pick your poison. But again, it opens the TLS conversation. A lot of applications that have kind of hyperscale requirements will use message buses as a way of kind of decoupling input rate of messages to processing rate of computation. And again, how does this work? It opens up the TLS conversation. A lot of organizations use Kubernetes as a way of doing modular, scalable computation deployment. Well, the first service a TLS connection hits in a Kubernetes cluster is oftentimes called a service mesh controller, which again opens up the TLS connection. So if your developers are trying to be quick, if your developers are trying to be very modern, if your organization is not some of the largest organizations, you're probably not managing any of these services I just mentioned on your own. You're probably using third parties. So now let's let this sink in. Any authentication or authorization system that we're using that relies on secrets, whether they're a password or a TOTP token, or really any kind of secret, if that protocol and those secrets depend on secrecy or confidentiality of the TLS channel, you now have to worry about all of these third parties from a perspective of insider threat, but more importantly, from a perspective of compromise, because your secrets now exist through all of their infrastructure. You've just had this massive expansion of surface area that you really have no control over, but have to understand and protect. Does anybody remember Cloud Bleed? This is just meant to show you how easy it is for a very sophisticated organization with really strong engineers to make a very small mistake where essentially a crafted packet to Cloudflare's infrastructure allowed the recipient to then read the TLS or specifically the HTTP parameter content of really any traffic flowing through that CDN service in the moment. It's easy to screw these things up. It's really hard to get them right all of the time. So again, this attack surface is just impossible. You really can't handle it. So what do we do? How do we fix the problem? Is this really just a password problem? And it's not. And we spent a little bit of time trying to find the right cartoon, and we're still not there. But I think this shows it a little bit better. We're still sending humans to fight robots, and what I mean by that is we conduct all of this phishing training. We deploy things like DNS protection. We deploy things like reverse proxies. We deploy things like certificate security, and all we're really doing is we're lowering the rate at which our humans actually click on the bad links. AI is certainly making these attacks more potent, right? With large language models and a very small training set, it's very easy to essentially emulate your writing style, your voice style, your appearance. It's even possible to do all of these things in real time, right? Like I think all it takes is 6 seconds of recording your outbound voicemail before I can actually imitate your voice to the point that your loved ones can't tell the difference. Robots are coming after you, but we're still expecting you to handle those robots through things like phishing training. This is fundamentally a problem. This is just a sequence diagram showing how the man-in-the-middle attack works. I'm actually going to skip through it because I don't think it advances the conversation that much. And here we wanted to show you just a quick little clip on how realistic the scenario I just painted is. And to preface this video, we actually didn't create the script. We actually used an exact play-by-play that happened in a real-life scenario where a bank was defrauded out of millions of dollars.
Hey, good morning. How can I help?
Hi, Ethan. Thanks so much for joining on such a short notice. We're bringing in a consultant to help us with expansion in Asia. We need to wire $500,000 to the consultancy today, and I brought in Jeremy, who is leading the project, to confirm the details.
Hey, Ethan. Yeah, we need this done today.
Got it. Can you send me the payment destination details?
Yes, I'm sending those through.
You should have them now.
Great. I'll go ahead and make the transfer.
Perfect.
Thanks again, Ethan.
Happy to help. Hey, good morning. How can I help?
Hi, Ethan. Thank you so much for joining on such a short notice.
We're bringing on a consultant to help us with expansions in Asia. We need to wire $500,000 to the consultancy today, and I brought in Jeremy,
who's leading the project, to confirm the details.
Hey, Ethan. Yeah, we need this done today.
Got it. Let me just authenticate really quick.
Perfect. Can you both verify with reality check first?
And then I'll go ahead and grab the payment details.
So that video was a realistic depiction because it actually happened. This bank was defrauded after many millions of dollars. It was a phish that started through a text message that escalated to a live video chat. And again, the point we're trying to make here is when you're thinking about modern defense, even if it's MFA and identity, you have to think about modern defense against the AI threat because it is real. Or put another way, you can't rely on humans to always do the right thing. So given everything that we've talked about, how do we rethink these fundamental structures? Can we eliminate these failures structurally? And what I mean by structurally is there a way to guarantee they never happen? Not do they happen less, but is there a way to guarantee that they actually never happen? And we think the answer is yes. And the first insight is a huge amount of these problems come from the credential moving. When a credential moves, remember that picture I showed you a little while ago? Each system it moves through, it leaves a little shadow of itself. It's almost like a ghost. And that shadow lives in memory. It could be swapped to disk. Every one of those shadows is a piece of digital asset that you don't control, that you can't see, that fundamentally is a surface area the adversary can actually steal the credential from. If you remember back to the US Treasury description, they stole a secret and used that secret to access a third party. So if we guaranteed a credential could never leave a system, then the adversary is then kind of reduced, right? Maybe they can trick the system into signing something on their behalf and then kind of impersonate the victim. And that leads to our second insight, which is how do we change the human's role to where if this connection is being interdicted, it's not up to the human or the person to understand the technicalities of what's happening. We can just solve it. So these are kind of the two key insights behind our belief of yes, we can. So if a credential is never moved, it can never be stolen. So clearly we're talking about public-private key cryptography, where the private key we're using as a signing key, right? This is how digital signatures work. So a signing key does not have to move, but that's not enough. We want to guarantee that it doesn't move. So we need one more piece of technology, and that's called a secure enclave. You may have heard of these things called TPMs, trusted protection modules, or trusted execution environments, or secure enclaves. There's a couple different phrases for them. But these are tiny little processors that exist outside of your main processor that have their own memory, that have their own non-volatile memory. Think of it as a way to persist data through power cycles that is secure for tampering, and never even resides in the computer's main memory, i.e. not susceptible to things like crash dumps and traditional malware. So let's talk about that a little bit. What does that actually look like? Well, Infineon is an example of a producer of these chips. You can think of it as a jail. You can create a key inside of a jail. And so if the key never leaves the jail, how is it useful? Well, you ask the key to sign things for you. So you send a piece of paper through the bars, the key will sign it. Now that's a naked key. You can also create keys with policy. And so policy, a good example of a policy key is you can ask the key to sign something for you, but then the key's going to say, well, wait a minute, give me a pen or give me a biometric, and only if it's the right one will I then sign something for you. Now, the obvious question we then run into is how widespread is this? This sounds pretty advanced. And the answer is they're actually everywhere. In fact, it's pretty difficult to buy electronics today that does not have this capability. So I'm going to take a slight digression to explain why is that the case? Why is it hard to buy electronics today that does not come with this capability? Well, back in the Stone Age, we used to have credit cards that had a magnetic stripe that you could read a pen off of, or not a pen, but a serial number. And that number was a secret. That number essentially was what the credit card companies and the merchants and the banks would use to then kind of decide who you are, whether you were authorized to make a payment, and then to kind of deduct that payment from your bank. Obviously, fraud was widespread in this particular world and with this particular system. And as a direct response, out of Europe, we got this really interesting thing called chip and pen. And so the idea is what if the credit card had a little tiny processor inside of it, and there was a signing key inside of that processor, right? That jail example I gave you a minute ago. And there was a policy on that signing key in that jail called a pen policy. So anytime someone wanted to charge you, it would send the bill in through that jail, but only if the holder of the credit card supplied the appropriate pen would that key actually sign the bill and hand it back. And of course, this is all done normal today. This is all done wirelessly. And you now know it ubiquitously in mobile payments, right? Whether you use Apple Pay or Google Pay to buy a cup of coffee in the morning. you're actually using this technology. And it's exactly what we just described. You go to buy your coffee, a bill is sent wirelessly to your mobile device. Your mobile device asks you if you want to pay for it. You'll notice in every case when it's asking, well, I shouldn't say in every case. If you're using mass transit, there's a way to turn off second factor. But generally, in every case, there's two factors. Possession is the first factor, and a biometric generally is the second. This is in the Apple case. If you've got a mask on or something and the biometric doesn't work, it will then revert to pen. And then assuming you do the correct pen or the correct biometric, that releases the policy to then sign the bill. The signed bill is then sent back to the merchant. Congratulations, you've now just done single device, right? Because it wasn't two devices, single device, multi-factor, phish-resistant authentication to buy your cup of coffee. So why did I take this detour through this example? Well, the reason why I took this detour is we can actually thank the credit card payments industry, and specifically mobile payments, for this reasoning on why we have enclaves in almost all modern electronics. Whether it's your phone or your laptop, an ability to create these keys that cannot move now exists everywhere. But remember, we said there was a second insight. It's not enough to guarantee a credential doesn't move. We have to also guarantee or provide some sort of protection where the victim, the person who holds the device, is not being asked to solve fundamentally what are technical problems. So how do we remove the human's role in this problem? How do we make it more obvious that connections get interdicted or man in the middle? And the answer is kind of in this wallet metaphor. So everyone understands inherently what a digital wallet is, right? It's a software program that runs on your device. It manages these keys in the enclave. And its job, when it receives the bill or the challenge, as we talked about earlier, its job is to figure out the legitimacy of the challenge. Its job is to figure out, should it actually even prompt you on whether to move forward with that. How does it actually do that? Well, without going too detailed, but showing a little bit of the answer, the challenge actually includes not just some parameters that you have to transform, but the challenge identifies itself. In this case, we're just saying it's a cloudservice.com as a generic name, and it's signing over this. And that's part of the solution. It's not all of the solution. But on the left side, you'll notice the client or the wallet, it's verifying the challenge. And it's doing something very much like certificate penning in that verification. So first and foremost, the signature has to actually match the origin of the challenge. That has to also match the service name of the TLS connection or the server name of the TLS connection. But in addition to that, the origin actually has to match an issuer of one of the keys that's actually in your enclave. And what that's doing is that's basically helping you ensure, that's the wallet making sure that it doesn't sign things on behalf of the user that are not actually coming from the cloud service. This is actually how you end the interdiction of connections, whether we're talking about man in the middle or man in the browser. So a couple of in the audience may be saying, wait a minute, aren't you just describing WebAuthn or FIDO2? And the answer is a little complicated. I am and I'm not. So what I just showed you was kind of a summarization that's fairly close to how WebAuthn works, but I also added a couple of things that don't necessarily exist in WebAuthn or FIDO at large. And I'll just say there's a couple of problems with the direction that FIDO has gone in the last year or so, at least for enterprise security. There's this problem of device enrollment. Like, what if I lose my device? What if I buy a new device? How do I actually get a new FIDO key onto that device? And for the consumer use case, it was decided that we're going to use this thing called passkey sync. So the provider of these passkeys, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Apple, they're going to just maintain backups of all of these keys for you. And whenever you log into a new phone, they'll move the key for you. Now, for those of you who are astute, you might have noticed, wait a minute, didn't you say one of the fundamental security properties is keys don't move? And the answer is yes. So they kind of not violate that security property. But the second thing that they do is not only do these keys that shouldn't move, but the authorization of their movement traces back to legacy MFA. It traces back to a password. And that just doesn't fly for an enterprise environment or enterprise security. And we have a little clip here. You can actually do a Google search for this and pull up the full doc on your own. Not only is passkey movement a problem from a defensibility and tracking perspective, but it's actually untrackable. It's not even possible today for you to identify, understand, audit, and inventory every physical location a copy of your passkey is actually stored in. So the core infrastructure, the core plumbing of this technology is very, very good. However, in order to make things usable in the consumer case, a lot of the guarantees that we look for in enterprise were actually weakened to the point of not being usable. So when we say, isn't this FIDO? Yes, but then you have to do a little bit more. And the little bit more is kind of what we call the tip of the iceberg. So first of all, this needs to work in a multi-platform environment. Second of all, this needs to work outside of the browser, right? WebAuthn is great inside of a browser, but how do I work with a native application? How do I work with a fat client or a legacy application or things that aren't necessarily built with embedded WebKits? There are ways. How do I actually solve the tracking problem that I mentioned of before? It's not trivial, and it's not acceptable to just tell your auditor you don't know where these keys are. How do you solve the problem of device enrollment? So it is a legitimate problem that must be solved from a usability perspective of how do you handle new devices. There are answers that are cryptographically strong on how to handle new devices that don't actually allow for key movement. So this is the conclusion of the talk. I really wanted to kind of amp up everyone's kind of curiosity around what do identity attacks look like? How are they happening in the wild? What are they taking advantage of? Where is state of the art in terms of open protocols, and what problems truly have to be solved for enterprise grade identity security? As I said earlier, my name is Jasson Casey. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Beyond Identity. We've been building these solutions since 2019. We believe we're a security company solving an identity problem. We believe that you don't actually have to compromise usability to have guarantees of security. And if we're waxing poetic, we believe keys should never move. We believe humans should never fight robots. And when you engage with us over time and you look at our roadmap, you'll see those two statements almost echo in everything we do. We've been around for a bit. Everything we do tries to follow secure by design premise. It's not just about a document that you sign with CISA. It's about who we hire. It's about how we design. It's about how we build. It's about how we deliver. It's how we operationalize a product. And it's also how we partner with customers. With that said, love to hear more about your problems and your use cases. Would love to talk more. We didn't really do anything but scratch the surface in this talk. So by all means, let's talk. These are a couple different ways you can reach out to me or the team at large. And thank you for your time.